Hello, everyone. How are you guys today? It's Aunt Nikki of Your Story Hour, and it's time to read again from The Mallards and Their Neighbors by Neil Wayne Northey. Chapter 21. Spink, the Bobolink Sings a Song. Some time after Redwing the Blackbird moved into the sheltered little cove, another neighbor arrived from the sunny Southland. He was black, with a design made up of white, brown, and gray. He was smaller than Redwing, and the first time Bud Smith saw him, he said, "Well, there is Spink the Bobolink back again." Spink the Bobolink was really an interesting fellow. He was a first cousin of Redwing the Blackbird, and perhaps that is the reason why he liked the marshy banks along the duck pond as Redwing did. Spink was also a first cousin of Burlingame the Meadowlark and Weaver the Oriole. Spink had two suits that he wore on different occasions. He also had two names. The flashy spring suit that he was wearing when he came to the duck pond on the Old Homestead was the one he wore in the Northland. He always came north about 2 weeks ahead of Mrs. Bobolink. Then all he had to do was sit around and sing. When Mrs. Bobolink arrived, they built a nest on the ground in the green meadow, as their cousin Burlingame the lark did, but not far from the sheltered little cove. They were different from their other cousin, Weaver the Oriole, when it came to nest building, for he built his nest on the springy limb of the old big elm that stood in the front yard by the grand old house. Perhaps you would like to know about Spink's other suit and his other name before hearing more of his adventures on the Old Homestead. You see, Spink had lived at the Old Homesteads 2 summers, for he had been hatched there 2 summers before. When Spink got ready to go to the sunny Southland to spend the winter, he changed his coat entirely. You would never have known him was the same bird. His coat was then quite plain, and he looked almost like Mrs. Bobolink in her modest yellowish-brown dress, with a few trimmings of yellow and white. No, you would have never known Spink in that suit. When he arrived in the sunny Southland, he lived in the rice fields and ate so much rice that he grew fat. People in the sunny Southland called him Ricebird because he ate so much rice. And he was not so well liked as he was in the Northland. For one thing, he was so busy eating rice that he even forgot to sing, and his drab coat surely was not anything in his favor. It was a good thing for Spink that he went on to South America to spend the winter after he had eaten his fill of rice, for he had so many friends and they ate so much rice that they were a nuisance. Mr. Rice Grower sometimes lost his patience entirely and killed many of Spink's friends. Here's a picture of Spink. And that one says, "Spink the Bobolink is back again," said Bud. And here's a colored picture. I do believe that is a pheasant flying. But the chapter hasn't said anything yet. We'll find out. But my, what a different fellow was Spink the Bobolink when he came back to the Old Homestead. He put on his best suit like a regular dandy, and he sang from morning until night. There were not many of the Mallards' neighbors who could sing except Redwing the Blackbird and Spink the Bobolink. It would be hard to imagine the Spoonbills or Diver the Jerby or Longlegs the Heron or Jack Snipe or any of the others singing. Yes, Redwing the Blackbird and Spink the Bobolink were about the best songsters at the duck pond. They often met and sang a duet together. Sometimes it was in the sheltered little cove or along the fuzzy cattails along the marshy banks, and sometimes they met in the green meadow or along Little River. Then Burlingame the Meadowlark would add his song to theirs. One day Spink the Bobolink did not appear for the regular concert. "I wonder what happened to Spink," said Redwing. Then he saw Spink flying towards the green meadow with a fat grasshopper in his beak, and he knew that Spink was too busy feeding a family to sing. It was not long until the baby Bobolinks were able to fly, and then the whole family played around in the green meadow and along the little river and by the duck pond. Soon they joined another family and another until there was a large flock of them together. Of course, Redwing's wee blackbirds had grown large also, and the wee blackbirds of Redwing's friends had grown large, so there was a large flock of blackbirds as well as bobolinks at the duck pond. And you should have heard those blackbirds sing. But Spink the bobolink was not doing much singing any more. He was changing his clothes and getting ready to start for the sunny Southland again. Perhaps he was thinking of the feast he would have in the rice fields on his way to his winter home. Spink would be ready to leave the chilly Northland a long time ahead of the blackbirds and the bluebirds and many of the feathered friends on the homestead. That was because he traveled slower and stopped over in the rice fields to get fat before continuing his long journey to South America. It was too bad that Spink and his friends had to make such pigs of themselves eating rice. It would have been all right if they had eaten what they needed and then had gone on, but Spink was not the same gentleman in the sunny Southland that he was in the land of cool breezes. He ate and grew fatter and fatter until Fearful the man came along and killed many of Spink's friends and ate them. Chapter 22. Mr. Bluebird visits the duck pond. Oh, it's Mr. Bluebird. Mr. and Mrs. Bluebird had built a nest in the nesting box that Bud Smith had made for them and set on an iron post in the front yard by the grand old house. Bud had used an iron post so that Hunting Cat could not climb up to the nest. The Bluebirds had 5 babies to feed, and with Robin Red and Jenny Wren and Weaver the Orioles and others all hunting bugs and caterpillars and worms around the grand old house, it was quite a job for everyone to find enough. One day Mr. Bluebird decided that he would fly over to the duck pond. He thought perhaps it would be easier to find something there for the baby bluebirds to eat. He did not know that Redwing the blackbird and Spink the bobolink and Burlingame the meadowlark and many other feathered friends had been hunting around the duck pond and through the green meadow. All he knew was that he had to find something to feed to the 5 baby bluebirds. Of course, some people would not have called them babies anymore. They were almost grown, for they had grown feathers, and within a few days they would be ready to leave the nest. But my, how much they could eat! While Mrs. Bluebird was looking for a fat grasshopper over by High Cliff, near where Molly and Peter lived, Mr. Bluebird flew across the green meadow to the jungle thicket by the duck pond and alighted on a wild berry bush to look around. Mr. Bluebird had been to the duck pond many times before. He and Mrs. Bluebird went to the duck pond and down a long little river in search of bugs and dried berries when they first came back to the old homestead from the sunny Southland. Mr. Bluebird had arrived a week or 2 ahead of Mrs. Bluebird, when food was rather scarce, and he had hunted alone until she came. After the baby bluebirds had been hatched, Mr. Bluebird had been too busy feeding them to go far from home. For that reason it had been quite a while since he'd visited the duck pond. He was wondering who was living there that year. He liked the duck pond with its marshy banks and the jungle thicket on one side of it, but he liked it up by the grand old house better. While Mr. Bluebird was looking around, he suddenly saw a movement on the ground. At first he thought it was a large worm crawling along. Then he noticed that something was pushing up the ground into a snake-like ridge. It seemed strange to see the ground rise in all sorts of twists and turns. Mr. Bluebird hopped down where he could see it better. "Now what do you suppose it is?" said Mr. Bluebird as the little ridge grew longer. Surely, that is a strange sight." Then, right while Mr. Bluebird was watching, the ground broke through and out popped the head of Miner the Mole. Windows open, that's why you're getting some outside noise. And let's see what that picture says. It says, Mr. and Mrs. Bluebird built a nest in the nesting box by the grand old house. And we'll do the other picture too. Oops. This one says, while Mr. Bluebird was watching, the ground broke through and out popped Miner the Mole. It's right where we were. Miner the Mole was a relative of Barney the Shrew, who lived in a woodshed by the grand old house and ate the ants and sawflies that fell out of the wood that Bud split. At first sight, both Barney and Miner looked something like Whiskers the mouse, but Barney and Miner did not have any ears that showed like Whiskers, and their eyes were not much better than none. Both of them had much longer noses than Whiskers had. No, Miner's eyes were not too good. He worked underground so much that he had little use for eyes. Sometimes at night, when the light was not strong enough to hurt his eyes, Miner came to the surface to hunt. That was usually on wet nights when the wriggly earthworms came to the surface. Miner surely was fond of wriggly earthworms. When Miner's nose appeared above ground, he was not quite sure whether it would be safe to show his head or not. He could not see and did not know if enemies were about. Mr. Bluebird was much interested in Miner the Mole. He wondered what Miner had been doing under the ground out of sight. "Hello, Mr. Mole," said Mr. Bluebird. "You seem to be busy today." Now Mr. Bluebird probably did not know it, but Miner the Mole was almost always busy. It was not uncommon for him to dig 100 feet of secret tunnels in a day and a night. It seemed as if Miner never rested and slept. Miner the Mole was ready to pull back his head and go on with his work when he heard Mr. Bluebird. "Yes, I'm busy," he said, "but who are you?" "I'm Mr. Bluebird, and I live in a nesting box by the grand old house." Of course, Miner the Mole did not know anything about the grand old house, and he did not know much about anything. He lived underground so much that almost everything was new and strange to him. "And what is the grand old house?" he asked. "That is the home of Bud and Mary Smith," replied Mr. Bluebird. "Bud built my nesting box for me." "How far is it to the grand old house?" asked Mr. Miner. "Oh, it's only a little way," said Mr. Bluebird. "It's across the green meadow." Mr. Bluebird did not realize what seemed a short distance for him to fly would be a long, long way for Miner the Mole to dig. It would be like a man in an automobile telling a man who was walking that it was a short distance to town. But Mr. Bluebird did not intend to fool Miner. And that is the end of our chapters. I was just looking to see how we have chapter 23 next. How many chapters do we have in this book? Regardless, we're getting through it. All right. Let's see. I'm curious. 30 is the last. All right. Well, it was good reading with you guys and visiting. I hope you're all doing well. Take care.